Hi, and welcome to another session of Searching for Answers. We're glad you're here with us as we work our way through the text of the Old or New Testament. Right now, we're in the New Testament in the second letter of Paul to his young colleague Timothy. You'll find that letter in your New Testament right between 1 Timothy and Titus. So while you get your Bibles, we'll get ourselves introduced and we'll get underway here. Joining me on the panel of this occasion is Pastor Ji-Yong Lee. Pastor Lee is an alumnus of La Sierra with the Master of Divinity degree and is finishing up a doctoral program as well at La Sierra in the School of Education, right? Also with us this evening is Pastor Ken Curtis. Pastor Curtis has his doctoral degree in spiritual nurture from Claremont University and is on the pastoral staff at Calamasa Church here in California. So, with such expertise, holding hands, we'll get right into the text. Find 2 Timothy chapter 2. We got just into the first couple paragraphs last time, and so we'll just quickly pick up the verses 11, 12, and 13, where you can see indented in the text of your Bible the stanzas, little couplets, where Paul says, "If we have died with him," that is with Jesus, "we will also live with him." Contrast between dying and living. "If we endure, we will also rule or reign with him. If we deny him, he will also deny us." And in verse 13, he adds a little twist. If we are faithless, the pattern would set us up to expect that it would mean that Jesus will not be faithful to us. But he says, no, even if we're faithless, Jesus remains faithful to us because that's in his nature. It's the way he is, as well as the way he chooses to relate to us, because he cannot deny himself and thus would not deny us either. The cadence of these little couplets here echoes in our mind as we move forward into the next few verses now in 2 Timothy chapter 2. This gets us located in our relationship to the divine. That is to say, we are summoned, even as Christ died, to let our earthly life be passed away even in faithfulness to Jesus, because we will live with him. If we endure, we will reign with him. If we deny him, he will turn his back on us, but never until we have made it absolute from our side. Jesus is not an unfaithful friend. He is always with us, always loving, even when we wander from his will for our lives and from his side. So, with that before us, here we go with verse 14. Let's take the next paragraph, 14, shall we say down through 17 or 19, sure. Something like that. Pastor Lee, get us into it then.
Remind them of this and warn them before God that they are to avoid wrangling over words, which does no good, but only ruins those who are listening. Do your best to present yourself to God as one approved by him, a worker who has no need to be ashamed, rightly explaining the word of truth. Avoid profane chatter, for it will lead people into more and more impiety, and their talk will spread like gangrene. Among them are Hymenaeus and Philetus, who have swerved from the truth by claiming that the resurrection has already taken place. They are upsetting the faith of some. But God's firm foundation stands, bearing this inscription: "The Lord knows those who are his, and let everyone who calls on the name of the Lord turn away from wickedness."
Oh, so now the advice becomes more specific and detailed and explicit and even personalized in a way, isn't it?
Very.
What do you think as you read these verses? This is the New Revised Standard you're reading from.
Yes. This passage is just so laden with so many different facets of being a Christian, different kinds of dangers, but at the same time hope too, ironically, in the midst of such gloomy, possibly gloomy message. But I would like to pose a question to both of you, going back to the beginning, the verses 14 and 15, beginning of the passage that we just read together. This concept of wrangling over words, what do we make of that? And how it leads to no good, but only ruins those who are listening. So is it a matter of wrangling over words being detrimental to the listeners? So if there are no listeners, then it's not as bad? Or is there something deeper that we need to get into? I don't have answers, but I'm searching. I would like to hear what you think about that.
Well, we're fellow searchers, I think, aren't we? But yes, so this business of wrangling over words can sometimes ring our bell as it echoes for people whom we've bumped into from time to time, even in our pastoral responsibilities, right? Where people are hung up about getting the language and the terminology just right. Click, clack, get it all locked up. The problem, of course, is that while truth is greater than us and is eternal, it has to be expressed in human language. And there's the rub, isn't it? Yeah? Because the language always falls short of the truth to which it points, doesn't it?
It does. I think maybe part of what gets us started towards grappling with answers for that question is thinking about the way that Paul poses kind of the question by what he writes here, or at least raises the question. In my version, the New International, I think it captures a little bit of the tense of the Greek word there. It says, keep reminding them of these things. And as I hear Paul using that phrase, I'm reminded that Paul's writing at the end of his life. He has been a Pharisee at one point in time when the details of the law and wrangling over words was very much a part of who he was and what his identity was. He had discovered what it meant to realize that you were struggling against Jesus and have a complete turnaround in his life. And then he lived a long time as a pastor, raising up new churches, mentoring younger pastors. And this is kind of his final opportunity to talk with them about what really matters. I think we noticed a couple of sessions back that as you move from 1 Timothy to 2 Timothy, Paul shifts into a more relational kind of mode. Less focus on the doctrine per se, and a little bit more focused on relational kinds of things and faithfulness and some of those themes. And so when I hear him start talking about that, it helps me kind of get a context for what he's saying here about wrangling about words and getting caught up in things that don't matter. As he's getting towards the end of his life, he's trying to help them focus on, what was this story really about that I've been living? I was reminded of this thing that I sometimes have observed with my wife, who is an avid reader, loves reading stories. But when she starts to get into the last chapter of a book, it suddenly takes a very long time to finish the book. It's like when you get to the last chapter, you slow down. And you begin to savor every word, and you begin to think more about, because you know that the story is about to end. And as much as you can go back to that book over and over again, it's never quite the same as experiencing it the first time. So I feel a little bit of that in Paul as he's writing here, and he's saying, keep reminding them of what matters. Warn them about quarreling about words. Those things that take you off track, that help you not to see the bigger picture of what he's trying to communicate. That, as he goes on to talk about, that create all kinds of problems and pulls us back towards what's central to him.
I think that the continuous sense in verse 14, did you say New International? Is that
Yes.
what you're... I think they capture the Greek there. It really is best translated. Keep on reminding them, continuously because people need, they need to be reminded, don't they, Brother Pastor? We so often get distracted. That's our problem. the Jewish people have traditionally made it a practice to pray, and I don't mean a hurried prayer over a meal, but I mean to really pray 3 times a day. And our Muslim friends upped the ante to 5 times a day. I think those traditions understand how readily we're distracted and how easily we forget who we are and what we're about. In fact, the story is that as Muslims tell the story, Prophet Muhammad has a conversation with God, with the Almighty, about how people should live their lives. And God tells Muhammad, tell them they need to pray constantly. I mean, it needs to be 50 times a day or something. And so Muhammad kind of gulps and he says, well, okay. On his way back, going down through the various levels of the heavens, he encounters Moses, who says, okay, how many times did God? And he says, well, 50. And Moses says, that's not going to work. It's not going to work. Go back up and see if you can raise the issue with the Lord a little more. And so Muhammad spends several trips back and forth negotiating between God and Moses. Moses, who is adamant, who says, I know these people. They're not going to do what... And so finally, Muhammad gets it down to 5. And Moses says, okay, how many times? Muhammad says 5. And that's all he wants. And Moses says, that's not going to work. I know, but Muhammad said, I'm not going back up there again anymore.
Keep it at 5.
So I think the lesson of the story, which has a little touch of humor about it, is not about Moses or Muhammad or God. It's about us. It's about what it is to be a human being and how readily we're turned aside from our highest and best intentions. And one of the occasions for that is cheap talk, verse 16, right?
Yes.
Yeah. We cheapen our language. We cheapen our thinking when we cheapen our language. And ultimately, the letter, as we have it before us, is right. It just opens up more and more impiety, and it spreads like a poisonous cancer, among the communities of faith. And a couple of church members there, we don't know the whole story, but apparently they have been kind of cheapening the faith, so to speak, Hymenaeus and Philetus, who swerved from the truth with some careless interpretations, claiming that they're already in the new life, the resurrection has taken place. We don't need to dwell on that in great detail, but it was clearly a notion that was popular in some circles. These people are named, but we do know that there was a kind of an illusory idea in the early, some congregations. And Paul just says they're upsetting people's faith in verse 18, because once you convince people of a false notion, then when it doesn't hold water, then their faith just fails and they lose their way entirely. And that's what it says here in 18. They're upsetting the faith of some of God's people.
Yeah.
God's foundation, however, is firm. Anything else in that paragraph? What do we see? What would we like our viewers to capture as they look at it with us here?
I think back in verse 15.
Yeah.
There's this admonition. So in the midst of all this, it says, so do your best to present yourself to God as one approved, a workman who does not need to be ashamed, and who correctly handles the word of truth.
Yeah.
So obviously these folks were arguing about words. They were arguing over the word of truth. They were focusing on things, but they were not handling God's word in the way that it was intended to be there. Now, the idea of Gnosticism takes your spiritual life and it removes it away from your actual lived existence. That there's this spiritual part of you that's the real thing, but your actual body, the life that you live and you interact with people, that's really insignificant. So the idea that what you believe here and these things you talk about changes the way you live, changes the way you interact with people. to handle the word of truth in a way that doesn't allow the words to take you away from the core of what the truth is.
That's the point, isn't it? Right.
Yeah.
People who are hung up on words sometimes can really get lost in a maze on the linguistic level, on the language. Some translations render this verse rightly dividing the word of truth. That may be an adequate representation of the Greek, but it really has the potential to mean slicing and dicing the language razor thin with all of the little nuances and fussing and judging people about this or that terminology. It's a trap we fall into. And particularly those of us who play the theological game are more susceptible, I think, to fall into that. It's so easy to narrow our scope of our vision down to where we really do lose sight of the forest for all the trees sometimes, can't we? So I'm glad that the NRSV, for example, says explaining the word of truth, because it keeps things on the right level rather than simply microscopic dissection of the language, right?
I'm appreciating very much what both of you are pointing out. Dr. Curtis, you went to verse 14 about wrangling over words and how that relates to Paul's being much more relational in 2 Timothy. And then Dr. Jones, you mentioned what stuck out to me very much right now is about cheapened talk or profane chatter in the NRSV. And putting that together, something just came into my mind. I wonder, well, number one, I never looked at it this way until tonight, but Paul, I suppose, could, like you mentioned, could be at least partially looking back at what he used to do. He must have been a pretty good wrangler of words who probably didn't lose too many arguments when he was the top Pharisee. So he knows what that's like and what kind of, what motivates a person to do that. And also the concept of cheap talk or profane chatter, especially in faith-related conversations, that's a very heavy topic. And I'm reminded of an experience I recently had as a chaplain at a hospital where a very young couple had lost their infant. Well, I mean, it was a fetal demise, so it wasn't even a few days, a few weeks, a few months old, but literally the surgery was to do what transpired because of some genetic defects that they knew about beforehand. So I got called in after the fetal demise had already happened. And I just naturally expected both the parents to be grieving or, I mean, assuming they would be in shock too, but, saddened, obviously. But they were very okay and actually trying to cater to me. And at first I was trying to just, follow their rhythm because everybody has a different way of dealing with acute grief. But it 10 minutes, 20 minutes passed, and they were still too okay. And so I tried to not coerce, their grief out of them, but just to at least open the floor for some honest grieving. And then the mother talked to me about some guilt that she was experiencing. And I asked her, well, what's the most difficult thing for you right now? And what she said next was very shocking. And it was, she said, well, the foremost thought in my mind is whether God is unhappy with me for making this decision. Here's this young mother who had been going through hell on earth. I mean, from the moment she found out about the genetic defect until the baby actually died. And she made the decision to lead to that result. But the first thing that she's talking to a chaplain about is whether God dislikes her for what's happening. And And apparently some church members had said some things regarding what's sin, what's not sin, and what she should be feeling guilty about, what she should be repenting about. And I just was so heartbroken to see that. And and then she's just looking at me with her husband, looking, because I'm the chaplain, because I'm supposed to have all the answers, in this very, very acute grief-stricken moment. And I just literally didn't know what to say. And I told them, I don't know what to say except the God whom I know personally and whom I serve. I can tell you one thing: the God whom I know would not dislike you in this moment for any reason. And if anything, I would like to believe that the God whom we serve and whom the Bible talks about would be crying with you right now and actually apologizing to you for not being able to comfort you more in this. And then that very moment, I kid you not, that very moment, they both start crying with tears streaming down their, including the father. And then we ended up having about a 2.5-hour conversation, and she was crying for about, or he was too, but about 2/3 of that time they were crying. And I didn't connect it to this until the two of you were responding to my question, and it just hit me, as ministers, because obviously, 1st and 2nd Timothy, the context is ministry and advice to a minister from one of the best ministers in the history of ministers. This whole concept of whatever we're teaching, whatever we're saying, whatever we're believing even, however we want to, as theologians, fight over it or argue over it, perhaps where the line gets drawn is what kind of effect it's having on the listeners, like he's saying here. In the end, is it comforting people who are hurting? And I decided tonight, after hearing the two of you speak, I decided that if, in the end, if our ministry does not comfort, then it's, what does the NRSV say? Profane chatter and wrangling over words. There's just way too much pain in the world for us not to be comforting people. So thank you for your responses.
There is a certain amount of irony that the words of Scripture can be used in ways that inflict pain in ways that they were never expected to.
Very much
There's so much that happens in our public discourse today where people feel strongly about a particular position or an issue.
Yes.
And we can produce things, with our media, we can say things with our mouths, and we feel like that maybe we're proclaiming a cause, and we don't realize that those words land in many different contexts, and don't always appreciate what people are genuinely struggling with.
Right.
And especially in the kind of situation you're talking about, you don't know what that family's going through and what was involved in the decisions that had to be made.
Right.
And when you're dealing with a developing fetus or a child that has no chance of survival, and you have procedures like that come, the guilt that can be inflicted on someone because of the harsh rhetoric that has been used in a discourse. I mean, we really do need to think carefully about what our words mean and that they ring differently in different contexts.
Very true. And not, of course, we're not advocating lack of theology, or because that's also the other side of the coin that Paul talks about, being careful about false doctrines, because it's not just emotions that lead our faith, but right thinking, right beliefs, right doctrine, but what we do with it, or what we do in our search for answers. And at least just to keep in mind, or keep reminding ourselves of the goal that should be of comforting, at least not hurting.
Yes. Well, it is, we struggle so much as humans, don't we? God knows us. We think we know God, but often what we make of God is a projection from within our own poor broken hearts and our our struggling faith, and then we wonder, don't we? And we accuse ourselves, and we attribute that to God, and it's difficult. And I think oftentimes our role as fellow pilgrims is not to somehow be authoritarian, but with some authority, not of our own, simply assure people of divine love and support. As we read here, right here in verse 19, God's firm foundation stands. Yeah, God knows what God is about, and it's sure. The Lord knows who are His. The Lord knows our poor, broken, struggling hearts, but we're still His, right? He remains faithful to us, we've just read in verse 13. And so the result then is that all of us who are called by the name of the Lord, our response is simply to turn away from rebelliousness. The word here really means a deliberate transgression, but that doesn't mean we have to make it on our own. We are weak, we fail, we stumble, we fall. This is not to make excuses, but it is to assure us of the divine commitment to us and invite us to return that commitment right back to God, who still cares and is trying to get us into heaven, not keep us out. And it's just so difficult for people to remember sometimes. Yeah. We wish, now this is where we wish you could pick up the phone and join the conversation with us, because we would like to hear from you. But for the moment, next conversation, we're going to move ahead and look at the next paragraph, which has a couple of rather interesting illustrations, little illustrative examples here that move us from the struggle with wrong-heartedness and our weakness to become what are labeled here as precious utensils and dedicated helpers of the kingdom. So it's, I think, partly a matter of simply assuring everyone who means well that God is on their side and pulling for them, somehow. Anything in the closing moments as we round off this conversation? Yeah. So this paragraph that we've looked at here, verses 14 through 19 of the second chapter of Paul's letter to Timothy, are verses that call us to remember how easily we're broken. Now, the next time we talk, we'll look at the verses that remind us of how valuable we are in God's kingdom and how much good work God can accomplish through us. So the tone will change next time when we meet together again on Searching for Answers.